Tales of Maj'Eyal is a game full of complex classes, so when one of them has a warning attached to it, it's a cause for concern. It partly exists because Possessor is unlocked just by buying the game, so a completely new player could potentially play it, but also because it's both its own unique class, a sort of psionic warrior, and every single other class in the game. The way it works is that you can become any enemy you defeat, other than the few elite bosses like the Master or Elandar. This gives you access to their health bar, resources, stats, and even talents. If you ever wondered what it would be like to play as Urkis or Celia, well, Possessor allows you to do that. This class could theoretically focus on any stat or weapon combination, but this video will be focusing on the talent-supported playstyle doing damage with weapons. In the first part of the video I'll give an overview of all of Possessor's talents, and in the second part I'll show you the character that I beat the game with, and how Possessor can become basically immortal, and talk about leveling, inscriptions and gear, which end up very different from the usual. It is also important to mention that my experience comes from the insane difficulty, and since Possessor is only as powerful as the enemies it faces, it might actually be easier to play this class on insane than normal, at least after a certain point. It is definitely much more fun since you get a lot more cool bodies to possess. So let's jump straight into it with the possession tree. Possess is how you get the bodies. It's a very weak damage over time effect that you need to spend a whole turn applying before killing your target. Then you can assume their form, getting access to all of their passive talents, and picking out a few active ones. Since enemies can have 2 or even 3 classes, it opens up all kinds of new cool interactions. For example, I had a body where I took mechanical arms from Psyshot, which automatically attacks enemies around you every turn, which then helped me quickly apply a stacking on-hit damage over time effect from Possessor, and then I was also Doombringer, so the mechanical arms would trigger stunning fire explosions from incinerating blows. Each new body is its own little puzzle, which is fun, but it is a lot of information to navigate, especially if you're not familiar with most of the classes. The downside to this talent is that you have a limited storage of bodies, and that it is not possible to heal the body by any means. So like health regen, infusions or lifesteal just don't work, so it is inevitable that your bodies will eventually perish. If you die while possessing a body, you will revert to your original form with a massive debuff, so you want to try to avoid that and keep finding new healthy bodies. You can't reach effective talent level 7 to be able to possess bosses without taking the Adept Prodigy or increasing the tree mastery, but even uniques are extremely powerful, and on insane they are everywhere. The last limitation is that you can only possess a limited amount of enemy types like undead, demon or humanoid. Thankfully you get enough of these charges so that you rarely feel impacted by this. I'll go over more detail about which bodies work the best and which enemy types to select in the build guide section. Self-persistence makes you keep some of the values from your original body. It's fine, but on the higher difficulties especially, enemies scale much harder than the player, so the far stronger talent is improved form. This is what makes Possessor so powerful. It is not because you can combine classes, it's because you can get this to 95% stats gained and 9.0 talent levels, which are usually impossible to achieve for the player. This also opens up cool options for items, because eventually you do not need much accuracy, powers or crit from yourself, you just get it from the omega scaled up enemies. Full control gives you access to resistances, speed and more talents from your new bodies, so you max it. Possessor then also gets Solipsism, which makes Psi function as a sort of second health bar, as a percentage of damage you take will lower your Psi instead of health. It also makes a percentage of healing affect your Psi instead, and this is weird anti-synergy since the HP on your bodies can't heal, but keeping your Psi high is very important, because falling below the Solipsism threshold will reduce your global speed. So this is very powerful damage reduction, but don't heavily invest into it before you get some emergency healing, like at least a healing infusion. Balance is meant for the Solipsist class, because it supports a heavy focus on just your mental save, but on Possessor you can get bodies that have all saves pretty high, so this just raises your Solipsism threshold. But it's worth it for Clarity, which gives you permanent global speed at high psi. Obviously super good, but only once you have the means to keep the global speed bonus, so it's safer to pick up late game. Dismissal is also for the mental save stacking Solipsists, so it can be safely ignored. Then you get 3 trees, each supporting different playstyles. Psionic Menace is for more of a caster. Instead of the usual first talent beam, you get a range 7 cooldown for Mind Whip, which can only hit 2 enemies. But it's still okay. Psychic Vibe does some damage over time, but primarily functions as a big mind save reduction, which is not needed early game, and later you can again solve it through bodies. Ghastly Veil damages and knocks enemies back, also dazing them. It's decent AoE, but the only talent I really like here is Finger of Death, which deals mind damage based on how much health the enemy already lost. And it is only damage capped against the bosses, so uniques are fair game. This is an awesome execute type talent, but ultimately this is the weakest of the 3 trees, or at least it's definitely the odd one out, because the other 2 focus on dealing mind damage through weapon attacks. And Psychic Blows is for two-handed weapons. Psychic Crush does big single target damage and makes a psionic clone of the enemy to fight for you. It's sort of like in the Demons, but melee, but you don't have to sleep the enemy first, so it's really good. Force Shield is a sustain that gives you one-shot protection, which is not very relevant since the bodies have stupid amounts of HP, but the permanent evasion and retaliation strikes make this very powerful. Keep in mind it's only active when you are wielding a two-handed weapon. I did some extra testing and it turns out what I said is not entirely true. The retaliation strikes only work when you have a two-handed weapon, but the evasion is functional no matter what weapons you wield. So even though you can swap between weapon sets instantly, sustains make it less appealing. Unleashed Mind is a nice little melee talent, hitting everything in range 6. Yeah, Death Dance is crying in the corner with its 2 radius. It might not seem like it, but this talent is unbelievably good. You can compare it to Ghastly Veil, where this will just end up doing way more damage. It lets you do things like this, or this, and it's a big reason to go two-handed weapons. Seismic Mind is a straight up worse version of the previous talent. It does comparable damage, but only in a cone instead of a radius, and it destroys your valuable psionic clones instead of prolonging their duration. With that being said, it's still a range 6 weapon attack, so it's the perfect follow-up to Unleashed Mind. Battle Psionics is for dual wielding a one-handed weapon plus Mind Star. Psionic Disruption is a sustain, giving more stats from the Mind Star, and a stacking damage over time, which applies even if you miss your attack, so this is great, reliable damage for Tier 1 dungeons, which is the only weak point of Possessor. I highly recommend quickly investing points here. Shock Star is a big damage attack that also stuns the enemy based on their Psionic Disruption stacks. This unfortunately means you can't open with it, since you need at least a stack to stun, but even on turn 2 or 3, stun is still incredibly valuable. Dazzling Lights blinds surrounding enemies, and then hits any successfully blinded adjacent enemies. Blind is a good debuff, but the only problem with this talent is that blind immunity makes it literally useless. Still, it's a better basic attack against the majority of enemies, so it's decent. Psionic Block gives you a 50% chance to fully ignore damage for 5 turns. When I first saw this talent, I had to read it like 10 times because I could not believe that it's real, but it is. No hooks attached, just ignore half of incoming attacks. In fact, it even does some damage. This is a big reason to go one-handed plus Mindstar. If only there was a way to always use both of these amazing weapon trees. Body Snatcher is crucial possession quality of life. Body's Reserve gives you more storage, and while theoretically you probably don't need this, it makes Possessor much more enjoyable to play, letting you experiment with weird class combinations. Psionic Minion destroys one of the bodies to summon it as an ally for a very long time. This is generally good, and it also lets you utilize powerful bodies that don't necessarily fit your build. So let's say a Bulwark or Demonologist, most of their talents don't work without a shield, so they suck for you, but they can be good as a Psionic Minion because the AI will generate its own weapons. Psionic Duplication lets you store multiple copies of one body. This sounds a little better than it is, because you want to be constantly using up your bodies, since you are going to keep finding better ones as you level up and progress through the game. But there are exceptions to this, like some bosses, and when you do find that perfect combination of classes and base enemy type, it feels very good to have another of the same body in reserve. Cannibalize is the only possible way to heal a body by consuming a different one of same or higher rank. Each time you do this, the heal gets heavily reduced, so you still can't keep a body around forever, but together with Psionic Duplication, it makes a massive difference. If you use this in combat, this will also fully replenish your Psi, since these will be enormous heals. Cannibalize is pretty much a must-have. Deep Horror has Mind Steal, which lets you steal an active talent from an enemy. You could even steal a Prodigy talent, for example, but unfortunately this costs 4 class points before it becomes usable, because stealing a random talent is pretty worthless. It also doesn't work on elite bosses, the enemies that take the longest to kill, and against the average unique that dies in a couple of turns, this feels like a waste of time. Spectral Dash is the only mobility talent Possessor has, but unfortunately it's not great, because of the targeting and enemy requirement, making it only useful for the Psi regen is also too low to make this good. Writhing Psionic Mass is one of the absolute best talents in the game on every other class other than Possessor. The two halves of this don't really synergize. You want the all resist / crit reduction from turn 1, whereas you want to save the debuff cleanses for later. But even if you ignore the cleanse, instant speed, 47% all resist, and 34% crit shrug for 5 turns is nuts. The problem is, you are not getting this talent early, because you kind of want to rush unlocking Body Snatcher, and probably also an Inscription, and later on you get more than enough all resist and tons of crit shrug from bodies, so this should actually be evaluated as just an instant speed debuff cleanse, which is still good, but not nearly as game changing. Ominous Form lets you copy a body without killing it. Sounds pretty cool, right? Well, unfortunately, this does not work if you are already in a body, and you really never want to spend any time in combat in your original form. That's like a turtle without a shell walking up to predators. So I think this is pretty awful. The generic side has 2 good but unexciting trees: Survival, where you want to pick up Track and possibly Device Mastery, and Mentalism, which has a bit of passive mind power, a really good mental debuff cleanse in Mental Shielding. Projection is a very interesting talent that allows for many wild interactions on Possessor. Down below I'll link a thread from 2017 discussing some of these, and I would assume these interactions still work the same in the current version. I personally don't enjoy playing with Projection, because it just sort of slows gameplay down, and Mind Link is a boss killer. Since your weapon talents do mind damage, this is a big boost for the few tanky enemies, which in Possessor's case is pretty much only the final boss. Ravenous Mind is a tree unique to Possessor, with Sadist, which passively gives you small stacks of mind power for every injured enemy. That's cool, but the real use for these stacks is Channel Pain, a sustain which consumes a bit of Psi to divide damage from big hits by at least 2 if you have stacks of Sadist. This is one of the best defensive sustains, but you need to be a little careful with it in the early game, because it can deplete your precious Psi pretty quickly. Radiate Agony makes Sadist affected enemies deal less damage to you, but I don't like this effect much, because it takes an entire turn and you can't use this as a pre-buff since the enemy needs to be damaged. So you are often better off just trying to kill them as fast as possible, even in big boss fights. And Torture Mind is one of the many random talent disables in ToME, and I find all of these abilities pretty useless, since scary enemies have a lot of talents, so you are very rarely going to feel this have an impact. So here's my guy, straight from the final boss. These are the items that I use, none of them affect gameplay, and as always, I've uploaded my full playthrough of High Peak and the final boss, without any commentary, just if you want to see how the class plays, and that's linked in the description. I'm excited to talk about this class because it's just so different from everything else. For stats, you're taking willpower and strength, kind of split, half and half. Strength makes you better at attacking, makes you do more damage, and willpower enables all of your talents and gives you more Psi. Third, you go Cunning, not much of a choice, and the last stat is Dexterity. For some of that accuracy and crit shrug off. Constitution doesn't really make sense since Solipsism reduces the amount of health you get. As I alluded to, I chose to play Ogre entirely for the reason that you can wield both a two-handed weapon and a Mind Star because of Grizzly Constitution. And by late game, I would assume this is the most powerful version of Possessor, but it's probably not the best race, simply for the reason that this does not really kick in until later. I chose this around level 25 as I got my first Prodigy, and then it feels really powerful, but the problem is all really Possessor needs to do is survive tier 1 dungeons, or rather survive until you can build up a storage of rare or ideally unique bodies, and Ogre doesn't really help with that. You get Ogre Wrath, which just makes your damage a little better, gives you some nice crit interactions, but this is not really going to save you. This improves the impact of your stats on infusions and runes, which is very powerful, but again, mostly manifests itself later on in the game. Also, for the effect of being able to use a two-handed weapon and an offhand item, you need 5 points in this. Even though I have Adept, this requires 5 raw talent points, it's called, which just a couple of talents in ToME require. It's not specified in the description, you just sort of have to figure it out. Then you get Scar Scripted Flash, it's pretty whatever, and then Writ Large doubles the cooldown reduction of your inscriptions for 10 turns once you get Adept. This is super good, since inscriptions are some of your best talents, and you can ignore this last part. Getting 6 inscriptions is cool, but the opportunity cost for this is super high, and you're almost never going to have the extra category points to spend on this. So Ogre is sort of aimed at that late game fantasy of utilizing both of these trees and just having the most amount of fun possible, but probably something like a Kornak, which can help accelerate your early game with the extra category point, or even Doom Elf so that you have some mobility, are smarter options since you're not really going to struggle past the first Prodigy anyways. Level 25 is so pivotal because Adept does not give you 1.5 to all known talent levels, it actually gives you 3.0 on most talent levels. What I mean by this is that it improves your improved form, so you kind of get the 1.5 here, and then once you swap into a body, all of these new talents also get improved by Adept. So you are double dipping, and you can see some of these talents are 10.5 talent level, so 9 from the improved form, and then again plus 1.5 from Adept. So this interaction is ridiculously powerful and makes Adept by far the best Prodigy you can take. It requires 50 cunning, which is quite easy to get on gear on insane difficulty, but if you play on normal or nightmare, you might want to sprinkle some points into cunning earlier, just so you can get this right on level 25, because it's just a massive game changer. Adept also double dips combat training, since a lot of enemies will have this, like thick skin, and the body's level of thick skin will get added to yours. So if I jump back to Masog here, and then I look at thick skin here, you can see it's at 21.7 effective talent level, and the same with weapon mastery. It's so high because I also have a cloak that increases the tree mastery of the tree, so it just gets pretty ridiculous. At the start of the game, your priority is to get your bodies as good as possible, so you want to invest the majority of your points in the possession tree, and sprinkle just enough in the rest of your class talents so that you survive. I died a couple of times in the early game testing out these trees, and Battle Psionics just seems like by far the best option, because it works well with very few points. And as you are leveling up, you might find yourself in a situation where maybe you don't have enough stats to invest into the talents that you want to invest in, and in that situation, these two talents should always be the place for any temporary points. So even like right now, I'd like to invest more here, but I can't, so I'm just going to put it into Psionic Disruption. Then on the next level, you can always take it out, spend as much as you can here, and then the leftovers go back into these two talents. And until level 25, you should use a one-headed weapon and a Mind Star. Also make sure that on the next level, you put all 3 points into Strength and put a point into Weapons Mastery, which gives you 30 physical power, increased weapon damage, and the first point makes a massive difference. On level 10, you want to invest your first category point into Body Snatcher. You start out with a point in Bodies Reserve, but getting this to at least 7 bodies will make the class feel much better, and it will give you some extra bodies to use on Psionic Minion, which can be very helpful to just put something out there to tank a little bit, deal some extra damage. You want 4 points in Possession to be able to possess Uniques and to get the extra enemy types. And next you want to put 2 points into Psionic Duplication. You can see I'm pretty careful about putting too many points into Solipsism, and the same down here into Channel Pain, just because you don't want your Psi to deplete too quickly, which can sometimes happen in the early game. If you feel like that's not a problem, you can invest into these talents earlier. And other than that, on the generic side, just make sure you put 2 points into Mental Shielding. This takes care of any mental debuffs for pretty much the whole game. And then putting 3 points into Combat Accuracy, since we are not going Dexterity, should make sure that we can still hit enemies. On level 20, you want to get your 4th Inscription, and by this point, you should have your Improved Form maxed out, Full Control maxed out, and very quickly approaching a pretty overpowered power level. In Body Snatcher, you should now have 2 copies of every new body you get. If 7 feels too restrictive, cut one of these points, or maybe from Shockstar, put it here so that you get 9 bodies. On the generic side, you should invest into Channel Pain at this point, get some great damage reduction, and by this point you want to slowly start investing points into Thick Skin and try to get Track. For these you will need to find gear that gives you those stats, but I'm just going to cheat those stats in, so yeah, maybe something like this should be reasonable to reach around level 20. By level 30, you should be fully transitioned into the 2-handed plus Mind Star playstyle, and you can take some points away from these 2 talents just so you get Unleashed Mind and Seismic Mind to 7 radius as fast as possible. This is a massive improvement in quality of life, since Possessor can struggle a little bit with mobility and getting close to enemies. On level 34, you have 2 options for your category point. You can either go into Deep Horror, but the only talent you really want from this is Writhing Psionic Mass, so instead you can also put this category point into Psionic Possession to improve the Tree Mastery by 0.2. This is almost never the correct option on any class, on any character, because it improves the skills by very little. But here it lets you get your talent levels from 8 to 9 So for any talents from the new body, it's like if you put this point into every single category, kind of. And then you also, I think, get an extra talent from full control. And you also get an extra enemy type to possess from possess. So in my opinion, this is more valuable than going into deep horror. It also lets you not stretch your class points really thin. By level 40, you're just sort of putting the finishing touches on everything. You can pick up Psionic Block. I only got Clarity by the very late game, because you keep swapping between bodies and some of them are better, some of them are worse, some of them you take more damage, some of them take less. So I just wanted to be sure that I'm going to get value out of going for Clarity. You can probably invest into it earlier if you are confident enough. On the generic side, do not sleep on Device Mastery. This is generally a really powerful talent, but on Possessor especially, items that give you actives are more powerful, since stats from your bodies get reduced a little bit, but any active items are just as powerful when you activate them in a body. So Device Mastery is really good. And this is the final version of the build. You can see that if I went Deep Horror, I would have to sacrifice probably points from these talents or from Psionic Disruption, because you have at least 3 points here. This is 4, 5. Then if you want to use Mind Steal, that's 2 more points here to get it to level 5. So it just gets expensive for not a lot of value. The second Prodigy that I picked up is Superpower. This is sort of a weaker version of Arcane Might, but for willpower. It's nice because it also boosts Mind Power, which is relevant for talents like Psychic Rush, so it just feels like a perfect fit. I thought about going Magic as the third stat and taking Arcane Might, and it's probably also very good, but this felt more thematic. And I think taking the second Prodigy to just increase your weapon damage is correct. You shouldn't really need something like Draconic Will for cleansing debuffs. I mean, you can take it, but things just die far too quickly to care about that. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that you can become immortal on Possessor. And it's time to talk about how, and it's connected to the inscriptions. So at the beginning of the game, I ran movement, shielding, and shatter afflictions. You could also just run a wild physical, since you have mental shielding to take care of any mental debuffs. Movement is self-explanatory, and shielding runes are the defensive inscription of choice, because you want to prevent damage to your body. You can't heal it, the only way is to prevent it. Then on level 20, once you get your next inscription, you should pick up a healing infusion. And it is at this point that you become functionally immortal, as long as you have any bodies in your storage. I have the perfect example where in Daikara I ran into a unique that casted Firescape or Hellscape on me. This is a classic, super easy way to die in tier 2 dungeons, since you can't run away. And on basically any other class, I would be dead here. But on Possessor, if you die in a body, the Assume Form talent, which you use to get in or out of bodies, does not go on cooldown. So the same turn that you become your original form and you could possibly be killed, you can just jump into a new body. The only downside is that since you take damage to your health as well as to your psi, if you died, you probably just took a lot of damage. So your psi might be pretty much 0, and you might not be able to cast Assume Form. This is why you take the healing infusion, so that you can guarantee you have enough psi to jump into a new body, and by this point your bodies should be durable enough. Even if you die again, your healing infusion should be off cooldown, so that you can jump into a new body, and then to a new body again. And you can do this pretty much endlessly, or until you run out of bodies, which shouldn't really ever happen. In this scenario, the enemy eventually just got bored. I'm not sure why they turned off Hellscape. They still had enough of him, but thankfully they just turned it off and I was able to run away and get out of that zone. This was the only time that I ever actually had to use the healing infusion. This is why it's on my second hotbar here, just so I don't ever accidentally press it, and because I don't really ever need to press it. But I think sacrificing an inscription slot to guarantee you can't ever die is pretty worth it. The reason you don't use this in your original 3 inscriptions is that at that point you might not have as many bodies. You might only have 4 or maybe 7, but then you might not even have multiple copies of them, and they will generally not be that powerful. So I didn't feel like sacrificing the combat power of having an escape, having a shield, and having a Shatter Afflictions is worth it. And you are also not likely to get Fear-scaped, although you can still definitely die. And then the last inscription, I picked up another shield rune. I prefer these over Storm Shield runes, just because I'm running around resistance capped with a massive amount of crit shrak, so I feel like having HP is better than the Storm Shield runes blocking a certain amount of high damage hits. Also, it's much harder to find a good Storm Shield rune, because you need to roll, the threshold needs to be high, the amount of blocks needs to be high, you also need high duration. Generally, the shield runes will have longer duration than the storm shields, and then you also need low cooldown. So I just like the simplicity of these shield runes. Now let's talk about the bodies and classes that you should be looking out for. In the very early game, mostly the bodies just give you the talents and their HP. So my favorite to possess were bears. They are pretty tanky and they have stun and knockback, which are better basic attacks, and I mean even just normal versions. The classes that are really good in the early game are Brawler, where you unequip your weapons. I just realized that I didn't really mention how gear works when you possess a form. Basically, your gear goes with you, but it gets locked in. You cannot change any of your equipped items once you get into a body. And when you want to become a Brawler, you unequip your weapons, then you jump into a Brawler, you take all of the unarmed attacks, you ignore any of the attacks that require weapons, and then once you get into the body, you want to go into Talents and scroll down for Striking Stance. This will not appear on your hotbar by default, you need to drag it down, and this is what makes Brawler so powerful. It gives you accuracy, damage, and flat damage reduction. So you want to make sure that this is always on, and this flat damage reduction makes you basically immortal in the early game. Or at least you die so slowly. Even though the fists don't do much damage, they do some, so this is a cool playstyle that you can use. Other classes I found success with are Summoners. Not the class Summoner, because those will have like the Hound and the Flame Spitter, which are pretty mediocre, but Annihilators and Necromancer. Because turrets, even if it's a level 1 turret, if you get upgrade and overclock, you just put the turret down, upgrade it, and then you can walk away, and the turret will kill pretty much anything. In a tier 1 dungeon, it can 1v1 rares. And on Necromancer, the skeletons are perhaps even more powerful. And what you can also do is you can swap to a Necromancer body, summon skeletons, and then swap to a different body, and the skeletons will stay with you. These two options sort of fall off later on in the game, because the Annihilator and Necromancer bodies usually they don't synergize with weapon attacks, but here in the very early game they are very powerful. Other than that, you ideally want some mobility, since Possessor doesn't have any, so something like a Tumble, super good, or a Lightning Speed that gives you a second movement inscription, super powerful. On Sun Paladins you will get the Chance for free, and they also have some pretty good talents like Wave of Power. But perhaps the best talent that you can get is Blinding Speed. Tons of melee weapon classes have this, so it's not too hard to find, and it's obviously ridiculously good. If a body has Blinding Speed, it's also likely to have Rush, which is the perfect gap closer. You can see here that on effective talent level 10.5, it even has 13 range. So if you spot something with track, you can rush to it without it being able to fight back. On more Maj'Eyal type characters, you also get Face Door, which is another excellent mobility talent. you shouldn't ever be afraid to pick sustains, even if you think they have like a high cost, because the enemies just have absolutely stupid amounts of resources, and they also have ridiculous resource regeneration, so you can pretty much never run out. This is a body I got in Dreadfell. It's just a Sun Paladin Undead. I have Weapon of Light Sustain, then Blinding Speed. It doesn't have the best accuracy, because it's more of like a mage-focused class combination, but it has Perfect Strike, which gives me 164 accuracy for 7 turns, so that's not a concern. And because it's this Banshee type, it also gives me immunity to pretty much every debuff in the game, so that's pretty nice. On top of that, since it's this Banshee base type, it can move through walls, just by default. And it can do this even on the world map, so, well, not through these, but it can move over these walls. So I can basically never get caught by the orcs, since I can just move through the walls, and in dungeons it's also obviously very powerful, since if you get ambushed by a bunch of enemies, you just leave. So yeah, I found this body in Dreadfell, and I think I probably could have just won the game with this, but of course you then get the Guardians once you come back from the east, and they are almost all of them really good options. I thought I would play as Alwyn, who has Gloom for just constant debuffs on enemies. It has Mark of Light, makes you heal from attacks, so it would basically permanently keep my psi really high. You get the Irresistible Sun Prodigy, Weapon of Wrath, scaling based on damage taken, which, as you can see, all of the bodies have absolutely stupid amounts of life, and then Stunning Blow, Weapon of Power, Rush, just the ideal combination. Once I use my primary attacks, I rush in, kill everything. But ultimately, I found the best body to be Masok, the Dragon Slayer, mostly because he has this sweet 57% all resist. The others also have some, 33%, 23%. This is the mob that's in the slime tunnels before you go to High Peak. Pretty good caster body. But yeah, Masok just has great stats, 90, 90, 90, 53 willpower, 44 cunning, pretty much perfect, great accuracy, great physical power. And then he has Berserker, which improves your physical power and accuracy by 60, so that's massive. He's an orc, so you get Pride of the Orcs to remove any debuffs and replenish your psi. You get Massive Blow as a Prodigy doing a ton of damage, and then you get Battle Call to call any enemies to melee range, as well as Rush, so you have plenty of mobility, capped out resists, still immunities to stun and to blind, massive crit shrug, really good saves, like 85 means it actually has an impact and you can resist effects from many uniques. Even defense, right? Having 77 defense is pretty good. And he also gives damage pen for some reason, which also helped me with my gear. So yeah, he's just absolutely brilliant. I use this same body to clear all of the Orc Prides and High Peak, and this is the amount of damage I took, 2,500. You can see I still have 3 more Masoks after this one. A couple of other kind of fun bodies. So Warmaster Narc has slow motion, which slows down projectiles by 90%. This means you are pretty much immune to projectiles, because someone will shoot a projectile and it will move like 1 tile every 5 turns, so it's never going to hit you. And then he also has Windblade as a Prodigy. It's just basically another big beefy Berserker. And then one more body I want to show you is Snaproot, who has 14,000 life. He's not that good in terms of the talents. He's mostly just a really good summoner, but he doesn't even have the Fire Drake. So I mostly kept it as like a emergency option if I just need to survive. And then I also cleared out the overpowered vault in the War Armory. I pretty much never do this because it is just needless risk, but I felt like there's almost a 0% chance that I'm going to die, and I wanted to see how good their bodies will be. And it turns out they are not that great, because the most powerful thing about them is that they have a stupid amount of levels in all of their breath talents. But since Possessor is limited to 9 talent levels, it's not nearly as powerful. And what's worse is that playing any body with Equilibrium is extremely annoying because you cannot reduce it. You have to refresh it to 0 by jumping out of the body and then jumping back inside the body, which is just annoying to do, because ideally you should do it after every fight. Really the coolest part about Possessor is that if you really want to, almost any body can work. I've played a throwing knife body for a while. Shadow Blade is really good because they have a bunch of really strong sustains. It doesn't only depend on the class, of course, because the way that the points are distributed is randomized, so any possible class combination could just have all the points in really bad talents. So there's not really any simple rule I can give you about what works. In terms of the enemy types, I ended up with these. I think the most common is a humanoid and undead, and you start with a humanoid, and undead should be one of your first pickups, not only because it's the most common, but some of the most overpowered bodies are undead, since they usually get a lot of immunities. And then demons and horrors are a bit more rare, but also have a bunch of immunities. Dragons are just fun to have, because you can play as the big dragon. I think I mainly got it because of the Daikara boss. And then insects are just pretty common, but not really that powerful. So it's like a low priority base type. And giants. What are giants? I guess in Daikara there's a bunch of giants, but I would also put that as a lower priority. Animals you get for free, and immovable you also get for free, I think, because you are ogre. Different races have a different starting enemy type, and immovable is pretty bad because they can't move. But with Adept and the category point, I think only once I ran into a situation where I wanted a body, but it was a type that I could not get. So on items, the main thing that you want to get is mind damage pen, and critical multiplier. Basically, damage above anything else, since you can get so many defensive stats from the bodies. Behind that, physical damage and physical pen is also useful, since sometimes these 2 talents or 3 talents might not kill everything, and you might have to use some physical talents or just basic attacks. This is not to say that like physical power, mind power, crit chance, accuracy, or even resists are useless. They are not. Not all bodies will have everything that you need, which is why you still max 6 skin and stuff like that, but it lets you get away with certain items that just are not justifiable normally. The perfect example of this is this Crimson Robe, which compared to crafted robes is just not great. It only gives 15% all resist, and you can craft one that will give you so much more resistance, but we don't need it. And in terms of offensive power, well, you might still prefer a crafted robe, but this one's really cool. It gives you some psi regeneration with psi on crit, and I'm always critting. It boosts global speed, even though it increases the Solipsism threshold, but by late game you are one-shotting enemies, so psi is just not a problem later on in the game. And then you get gloom effects on hit, which is like some stun and I think a slow, maybe a confusion, just good stuff. And you can apply Agony and Hateful Whisper through these talents, because they are mind powers, despite being weapon attacks. As my weapon, for my weapon I have a Blighted Maul, which I use simply because it has the highest percentage, and 40% crit multi. I spent like 10,000 trying to craft a better weapon, and Blighted Maul just ended up doing the most damage every single time. The downside of this is that it converts 20% to Blight, and it only has an 83% attack speed. Turns out the attack speed doesn't actually affect Unleash Mind or Seismic Mind, because they are mind powers. You can see the usage speed is mind, so it uses this speed, not the attack speed. Whereas if I jump into like Masoch, you can see here on Stunning Blow it says usage speed weapon, and the lower attack speed is factored in. So Blighted Maul is almost perfect. Aiden's Guile is just really good. It allows you to pick bodies that do not have blinding speed, and then the rest is mostly just all damage, some extra psi, some more damage, crit multi, some more damage, this random belt that I never replaced because I never found an orange belt, Psionic Shield as always, to massively boost your survivability, some more damage, powers and damage, crit multi and damage, and on my Mind Star it's crit multi and damage again. Now, during the leveling process you can still gear really offensively, since you can't get one shot, right? Worst case scenario, your body just dies, and then you can hopefully run away or jump into a new one. But I'll be honest, most of the game my gear was just random. I didn't really know what I'm really doing. It didn't really feel that important. It just felt if I find a good body, that's all you really need. So don't stress about it too much. One interesting option you have is to find an item with lifesteal. And, well, I think there are just two. Either this weapon, which has a 5% lifesteal, or there is a ring if you do the brawler minigame in the slaver location. And this can help you keep your psi topped off, but I just did not feel the need for this. Make sure to familiarize yourself with this menu, because sometimes some talents might not appear on your hotbar. So like, this is kind of weird because it only shows 6 possession talents, but I have access to 8. So I'm not sure if I drag this off my hotbar, I'm not sure how I would get it back. Maybe once I swap to the body, it comes back in some way. And it also allows you to check any of your new passives from your bodies. For the elixirs, you want class points, then generic points, then physical crit chance, then probably +5 strength, or I think it's +3 strength, then +3 willpower, and that's probably all you're going to get. And for the escorts, strength is good, willpower is good, cunning is good, but passives have a lot of extra value since you are taking Adept. So something like Unflinching Resolve, this usually on level 1 helps you recover from stuns, but you should have stun immunity, so it's usually not good as an escort reward, but on level 2 it can help you recover from blind, which I think is worth taking. Also from a Tinker escort you can pick up Last Engineer Standing, which with Adept also gives you 5 cunning, as well as 15% crit reduction. This class is definitely the most confusing that I've played. I have 1000 hours in this game, and still I sometimes picked talents that I couldn't use because they were for different weapons, or it just worked differently than how I thought it would. It's a lot of trial and error, but at the same time the class is so powerful that it's pretty forgiving, and you get so many bodies that even if you pick the wrong talents and you sort of ruin a body, you're going to find a new one pretty quickly, at least on Insane. So in the end I found it manageable, but if you are a new player it might just be too much to enjoy, because every time you will click on a body you will have to read through every single talent if you don't know what they do, and that's just too much information. But hopefully this video can either help you make it a little easier, or at least show you how awesome this class is.